What's the next event on God's calendar? I think that's a question that absolutely everyone wants to know. Now, when we're thinking about God's prophetic calendar, a lot of times people use a picture of a watch, like a wristwatch, where the hour hand are events in the world and the minute hand are events in the church. And these hands tell us that we're getting close, but they don't really tell us when things are going to begin with precision. But events in Israel, those are the second hand. They tell us with precision what's going to happen. Israel is ground zero in terms of God's prophetic calendar. Now, in order to discuss this very interesting topic with us today, we have a fan favorite of this channel with us today in the studio. His name is Fisherman, and he is a member of our advisory board. And Fisherman, I bet you would agree that the coronavirus pandemic has really put end times on everyone's mind. In fact, there are a lot of people who are out there saying that the 70th week of Daniel has already begun. Now, our advisory board sees events like the coronavirus, which are world events and church events mostly, as the hour hand and the minute hand. But events in Israel, those are the second hand. So what do you think the next prophetic event in Israel is going to be? Some think Gog Magog war, some think the signing of a covenant, some think a red heifer, some think the third temple. But what do you think is the next event to happen in Israel?
That's a great question. I'm personally looking for the resumption of the daily sacrifice. The Temple Institute Jews are ready at a moment's notice to resume these daily sacrifices immediately. They've gone to great lengths and have prepared the utensils, the garments, the altar. They've trained their priests, and they know the location, or they think they know where the location of the original altar was. And so they've even rationalized not having a red heifer or a physical temple to kick things off, even though these things would be preferable in their minds.
The daily sacrifices, the Tamid. I think that's something that very few of our viewers are actually keeping their eye out for. They're watching for these other events, but not that. But yet, if the Antichrist is going to take away the daily sacrifices, he certainly is going to have them be started. So why don't you describe for our listeners what the Tamid is and why it has to take place on the Temple Mount?
Well, the daily sacrifices are known as the Olah Tamid. Olah meaning burnt offering, and Tamid means the continual. And the morning and evening sacrifice is considered by some religious Jews to be the most important of all the temple services, as mandated in Exodus 29. And this is a burnt offering offered every evening and every morning and was supposed to be perpetual. The reason it's considered the most important by many is that it represents day in, day out acknowledgement of the Lord Almighty. And it's mundane, it's repetitive, and it's simple. But just in the devotion that they have to apply to doing this day in, day out, like brushing your teeth, that they consider it to be a reflection of the most important sacrifice. Has to be offered at the site that God chose and no other. And this we know from Deuteronomy 12. It turned out to be the threshing floor of Aruna on Mount Moriah, where David was commanded to perform sacrifice and offering to stem the plague caused by the sin of the census. And this is the place that God chose, and the Jews are precluded from offering it anywhere else in the land of Israel, according to Deuteronomy 12.
Now, what's interesting is architect Lev Rittmeyer has actually found that spot just a little bit east of the Dome of the Rock. It's a very interesting location. It's not in an inaccessible place. It's not going to interfere with Muslim worship in any way, or no building needs to be taken down. And the Jewish altar can be rolled right up into place for that sacrifice to take place. So it's very interesting. But there are a lot of Christians who believe the red heifer needs to be sacrificed first before those sacrifices can take place. And frankly, There are some who even believe it's already taken place. What do you think about that? Do you think the red heifer has already been sacrificed?
Well, not in my opinion. They plan to perform the service on the Mount of Olives at the exact location where it was performed historically, and they seem to know where that is. And it's on the west slope of the Mount of Olives, directly across from the entrance to the second temple. And this would be something that would be observable. I mean, it's not going to be in secret. People would know because they're going to be right on that spot, and it's out in the open.
I have to agree. There is no way that Jewish tradition will allow the red heifer to be sacrificed anywhere but on the Mount of Olives. So it couldn't have happened yet. Could you imagine the outcry from animal rights activists or the Muslims if it had already taken place? We will know it when that happens. But yet there are some who believe that the red heifer is necessary before we can have sacrifices on the Temple Mount. After all, they would say, don't those ashes make the priests righteous before God in order to offer those sacrifices? What do you have to say about that?
Well, that's a great question. And I've asked this of the leaders of the Temple Institute specifically, and that they've replied, because I was under the impression also that at one point that they had to do the red heifer ceremony before they could resume the daily. But they've answered that if everybody is unclean ritually, and that the word is tameh, so if everyone is tameh, as is the case now, then it's permissible to perform the daily without the ashes of the red heifer. It's less than ideal in their mind, but they feel that if they have the ability to resume the daily, as long as everybody is tameh, that they could do that. And if you think about it, the very first time the ceremony was performed, everybody was tameh, and I think that's the rationale that they're using. So there is a reason for resuming the daily, even without the ritual cleansing provided by the ashes of the red heifer. But that's a great question.
And I think you were saying that David performed the first sacrifice of the site on the altar, when he was Tameh, right?
Exactly. David was not ritually clean at that point. And he did it. The very first time that a sacrifice was offered on that side of the altar, David himself was Tameh.
But what about a temple? Does a temple have to be built before the sacrifices take place? I mean, a lot of people feel that's what's the next event. What do the religious Jews have to say about the building of a temple?
Well, in Ezra 3, we see that the daily sacrifices were resumed by Ezra and his crowd before the foundation of the second temple was even laid. So this is the rationale the Temple Institute uses to justify that they can resume the daily even without a physical temple structure. And they've stated this so publicly. I'd asked them and they had replied to me, but they also put this on their site. So definitely a third temple is not necessary for the daily to resume or to be stopped once it's resumed. And I'm of the opinion, I definitely think the daily will resume before we have a third temple structure. That would be what I would be looking for.
So there's really nothing holding the Jews back from beginning sacrifices on the Temple Mount except permission. They need permission from the Israeli government, and they need permission from the Muslim Waqf who controls the Temple Mount. So how are they going to get that permission? That's what brings up the idea of a covenant. And many immediately are thinking of the covenant with the many in Daniel 9:27. Is that the covenant that is going to launch sacrifices? What are your thoughts on that?
With that, the Hebrew word that's used in Daniel 9:27 for covenant is berit, or Brit, we know as a covenant. A Brit does not have to be signed off to be a covenant, at least in the Hebrew language. So it's not something that necessarily has to be signed off on as in a signed treaty. If we look at the description of the new covenant, for instance, in Jeremiah 31, we see that the new covenant was described as a Brit, but it's never been signed off. There wasn't a signature anywhere on a piece of paper. And it was described as a Brit.
Could I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
You would have to say, though, that Jesus's blood on the cross was a way of signing it, right?
That's correct. That's
Okay.
correct. So that was inaugurated 600 years after it was described as a Brit. So, I don't think it's something that we have to see as validated or executed in the sense that we normally think of it in our Western minds, because a Brit can be any kind of agreement between two people, whether it's signed off or not. So I think the meaning of Brit is much broader than what we think of in English when we think of covenant.
I agree completely. The he in that passage, Daniel 9:27, is going to strengthen a pre-existing covenant. He's not going to make one. The Hebrew word is gabar, for strengthen, and there has to be some sort of pre-existing covenant that is going to be strengthened. Now, it's my personal opinion that the he in that passage is Jesus. And we just did a video recommended by Bishop Judah, a member of our community, on who the many are. It's really a fascinating video. I think everybody should watch that also. But just to show everyone that our advisory board and actually the church in general are just not agreed on who that he is. For instance, I think it's Jesus. You happen to think it's probably the Antichrist. And just goes to show that good Christian people and even members of the same ministry can disagree about certain topics. However, there is a third option, isn't there? That third option is that there's a covenant that's totally independent of Daniel 9:27, independent of the 70th week of Daniel, independent of the Antichrist. Just a covenant that allows Israel to begin the sacrifices. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'm truly open on this. No one knows for sure. No one knows this answer for sure, and we've gone back and forth, and others have gone back and forth on this, and they have good reasons for believing the way that they do, and I respect that. Some believe, as you do, that it refers to a strengthening of the new covenant by Yeshua with his people. Others, right now, I'm more persuaded that it may refer to the Antichrist, who causes a strengthening of the covenant. The Hebrew is a hyphal; it's a third-person causative verb. So it may refer to the Antichrist causing a strengthening of an agreement, not necessarily something that's obvious or signed off on. And I believe any covenant in this regard would be one that would lead to a division of the land of the everlasting covenant. The result of that being God's judgment on the nations, according to Joel 3 and Isaiah 24.
Right. The dividing of the land of Israel in exchange for sacrifices could happen at any time, independent of the 70th week of Daniel, independent of the Antichrist. But I think you'd have to agree that in order for something of the magnitude of the dividing of Israel or the beginning of sacrifices to take place, there's going to have to be a contract of some kind, a covenant of some kind, an agreement of some kind. These are world-shaking events. Now, there might be an unknown, mysterious, pre-existing agreement of some kind that we don't know about that strengthens, but there has to be some sort of agreement if something like that happens.
Yes, I agree that the issue is division of the land. From Joel 3 and Isaiah 24, that is the proximate cause of judgment, according to those passages. So I believe that any Brit will involve the act of Jacob ceding portions of the land of the everlasting covenant to Esau. That's land that was promised perpetually to Jacob, actually beginning with the promise to Abraham in Genesis 17. If Jacob cedes land to Esau, then that is going to be viewed as permanent in the eyes, a permanent division in the eyes of the world. And again, this leads to judgment, as we know from the passages in Joel and Isaiah. And in a sense, we got a taste of this already. Israel was about to annex the Jordan Valley when the leader of the United Arab Emirates offered peace with Israel through the Abraham Accords, that Israel would just refrain from annexation of the valley, which is clearly a part of the land of the everlasting covenant. So at some point, maybe further down the road, nations like Saudi Arabia will join the Abraham Accords, but not before extracting some like concession from Israel in the same way. Don't do that, and we'll make peace with you. And so that's how I would envision it could possibly play out.
Yeah, personally, I've been a little surprised that Saudi Arabia isn't part of the Abraham Accords as well. It's just a little hard to judge when that exactly is going to happen. That's another thing we should always keep our eyes on.
Well, the pressure is building on them. I mean, with Iranian drone strikes and the Houthis are shooting at Riyadh, eventually they're going to join. I mean, and you know what else? They're jealous, I think, of the relationship that Israel is developing with the United Arab Emirates. I mean, UAE is already getting advanced arms that had been blocked. They're getting that from the United States, and those ties are flourishing. And I think that's, Saudi is kind of the odd man out at the moment, and yet they're under pressure, militarily, and that's only going to increase as Iran gets closer to a nuclear, weapon.
Why do you think Israel would allow the dividing of the land? I mean, that's a really big deal. I don't personally think the resumption of sacrifices are big enough to trade for the dividing of your land. So do you think it's a peace treaty? Do you think it's a disarmament? What do you think is going on there? And are the resumption of sacrifices just a sweetener to get Israel to sign it? Or frankly, is Israel forced into signing a deal like that? What are your thoughts?
Well, the Israelis want peace with its neighbors more than practically anything else. They would walk practically barefoot across hot coals if they could entice others like the Saudis to join the accords. There's a sense among many Israelis, and keep in mind, Israel is a very heterogeneous society. Only about a third of them are religious. 2/3 are secular, as we see in the United States. Well, there's a sense among many Israelis, particularly in the secular camp, that they'll never get all of the land back. So they're willing to give up claim to the land, which they don't feel they can recover anyway, in order to gain peace. I think that as other nations join the accords, at some point, the Jews may obtain permission to resume the daily. But that Arab outrage on the street is likely going to cut that very short. I don't think it'll last very long once they do it.
So a peace treaty is one way that the sacrifices could begin, maybe the most likely way. But what are other possibilities for how those sacrifices could begin?
Well, any allowance for resumption of Jewish worship on the Temple Mount, which would occur on the Southeast Plaza outside the Dome of the Rock, would be for political showmanship, in my opinion. Maybe an Arab leader will allow it to appear to be magnanimous, but then he'll stop it as Arab outrage from the streets erupts. But he'll be widely acclaimed by Jew and Arab alike for making peace with Israel. Another possibility might be that Israel comes under extreme duress from being attacked, or by plague, or by some other disaster. Or maybe they'll feel like they need to perform a preemptive strike on Iran, which even this past week, it was estimated that they're weeks away from a nuclear breakout. The religious Jews among them may convince the government that the daily sacrifice has to be resumed in order for God to bless whatever action it may take, and to get Israel out of a predicament. And this is much like David did when he performed the sacrifice in order to stem the plague after the sin of the census. So Israel being under duress, or maybe just showmanship in the political arena, could lead to resumption of the daily as I see it.
Thanks for joining us today, Fisherman. These were great thoughts. But Passover is coming. And there is a giant misconception in the church that the beginning of Passover sacrifices will actually initiate the 70th week of Daniel. Passover sacrifices are not the Tamid. They're different things. And although the Jewish people are trying desperately to get the Passover sacrifice to begin also, it's not the beginning of a Tamid. And yet, Scripture seems to indicate when those sacrifices begin during the 70th week of Daniel. So click right here to see when those sacrifices might begin, why the Antichrist might eventually take them away, and what the impact is going to be on the nations round about Israel. Till then, this is Nelson and Fisher Man, and I will see you there.